Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? In the book of Exodus, Moses and Aaron visit Egypt's Pharaoh on behalf of the Israelites, asking that he let God's people go out of slavery. After time and again of Pharaoh saying no and even punishing the Israelites for this, Exodus 5:6-9, God sends 10 plagues on Egypt. As we see after each of the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh's heart became hard, or he hardened his own heart. Then, in plagues 6-10, we see this pattern change. 4 of the last 5 times the author of Exodus, Moses, writes that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Seems counterintuitive, right? As Pharaoh physically ruled over God's chosen people, it became clear that he held evil intent for the Israelites. He hated the Israelites, as he saw them as a threat to his throne. Their number reached about 2.5 million, and Pharaoh got scared that they might take over the country. Also, the enslaved Israelites were a free source of labor needed for erecting pyramids and other colossal Egyptian structures. Understandably, the Pharaoh could not afford to lose such force. To prove that they had no intent to overthrow the Pharaoh, the Israelites asked him to let them leave Egypt. The Pharaoh obviously did not take their word for it and caused all sorts of obstacles. To free his people, God sent 10 plagues as punishment on Egypt. The Pharaoh could have saved his own people from the plagues had he only let the Israelites go. But he put himself above God of Israel, undermining his authority or even questioning his very existence. Pharaoh questioned, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." The ensuing chapters show the result of Pharaoh's stubborn refusal to acknowledge God. All of Egypt's water was turned to blood. The entire nation was filled with frogs and gnats and flies. Even the livestock of every Egyptian fell dead, while the Israelites remained standing. But this wasn't enough for Pharaoh to obey God's command. This shows that Pharaoh had reached a point of no return. For a quick reminder, here's a rundown list that shows the wording following each of the 10 plagues. Plague number 1. Blood, Pharaoh's heart became hard. Exodus 7:22. Number 2. Frogs, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Exodus 8:15. Number 3. Gnats, Pharaoh's heart was hard. Exodus 8:19. Number 4. Flies, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Exodus 8:32. Number 5. Livestock die, Pharaoh's heart was hard. Exodus 9:7. Number 6. Boils, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus 9:12. Number 7. Hail, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Exodus chapter 9:34. Number 8. Locusts, God announces that he has hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus chapter 10:20. Number 9. Darkness, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus chapter 10:27. Number 10. Death of the firstborn, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Exodus chapters 11:10. With each plague right there for reference, let's analyze this section of Exodus and see why God acts this way. Looking at it in black and white, without context, you may think God is engineering this evil in Pharaoh by hardening his heart. Instead, he's repurposing what's already there. If you've also read Genesis, which immediately precedes Exodus, you might remember Joseph's quote in chapter 50 verse 20 about God taking what humanity meant for evil and using it for good. A similar situation is taking place here. In a decisively final way, God hardens Pharaoh's heart by taking his firstborn son. Only then does Pharaoh let the Israelites go, and he still saddles up his army and decides to chase them through the Red Sea. This ultimately leads to his death and to disruption throughout Egypt. If we remember that Pharaoh was given one chance after another to listen to God and let Israel go, then we'll be able to move past the knee-jerk reaction of making this passage about God's anger and instead notice his mercy. Before the first 5 plagues, God performed miracles through Moses and Aaron in front of Pharaoh, ones that his magicians couldn't replicate, and even caused them to believe in God. This is proof of one of God's characteristics which he reveals to Moses later in Exodus 34:6-7, which is that he's indeed slow to anger. Pharaoh was handed over to his own evil, which conclusively caused his downfall. This was all predicted by God from the start. In Exodus 4:21, when he said he'd harden Pharaoh's heart against him. Rather than indicating God created the evil inside Pharaoh from the get-go, this shows that he gives humans the choice to make their own decisions and turn to him. When that wasn't the case in this situation, he turned evil around and used it for good to deliver on his covenant promise to the family of Abraham. Paul writes about this story in Romans 9:17-22. He says, "Therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and he hardens whom he wills." Later, Paul adds, "Has the potter no right over the clay, to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use?" This part of the Exodus story is effectively showing how God uses his power, which is totally unique to him. So why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? In one regard, it was to accomplish his purpose of redemption. In another sense, God hardened Pharaoh's heart because that's exactly the path that Pharaoh had already chosen for himself. This is a pivotal point in the Old Testament, really the biblical story as a whole, and it's a key example of God holding true to his covenant with the Israelites. To reiterate what has already been said, and to make it even clearer, why God had hardened the Pharaoh's heart, we can sum up the answer as following. Exodus 7:3-4 says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I will bring out my people, the Israelites." It seems unjust for God to harden Pharaoh's heart, and then to punish Pharaoh and Egypt for what Pharaoh decided when his heart was hardened. Why would God harden Pharaoh's heart just so he could judge Egypt more severely with additional plagues? First, Pharaoh was not an innocent or godly man. He was a brutal dictator, overseeing the terrible abuse and oppression of the Israelites, who likely numbered over 2.5 million people at that time. The Egyptian pharaohs had enslaved the Israelites for 400 years. A previous pharaoh, possibly even the pharaoh in question, ordered that male Israelite babies be killed at birth. Exodus 1:16. The pharaoh God hardened was an evil man, and the nation he ruled agreed with, or at least did not oppose, his evil actions. Second, on at least a couple occasions, Pharaoh hardened his own heart against letting the Israelites go. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart. Exodus 8:15. But this time also Pharaoh hardened his heart. Exodus 8:32. It seems that God and Pharaoh were both active in one way or another in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. As the plagues continued, God gave Pharaoh increasingly severe warnings of the final judgment to come. Pharaoh chose to bring further judgment on himself and his nation by hardening his own heart against God's commands. It could be that, as a result of Pharaoh's hard-heartedness, God hardened Pharaoh's heart even further, allowing for the last few plagues and bringing God's full glory into view. Pharaoh and Egypt had brought these judgments on themselves with 400 years of slavery and mass murder. Since the wages of sin is death, Romans chapter 6:23, and Pharaoh and Egypt had horribly sinned against God, it would have been just if God had completely annihilated Egypt. Therefore, God's hardening Pharaoh's heart was not unjust, and his bringing additional plagues against Egypt was not unjust. The plagues, as terrible as they were, actually demonstrate God's mercy in not completely destroying Egypt, which would have been a perfectly just penalty, as in case of Sodom and Gomorrah, for example. Romans 9:17-18 declares, "For the scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." Therefore God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. From a human perspective, it seems wrong for God to harden a person and then punish the person he has hardened. Biblically speaking, however, we have all sinned against God, Romans 3:23, and the just penalty for that sin is death, Romans 6:23. Therefore, God's hardening and punishing a person is not unjust. It is actually merciful in comparison to what the person deserves.